Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Midweek Worship at Two Cities Church. Thank you for joining me. My name is Jeff, and we're Two Cities Church, and I hope that this digital broadcast is helping you to understand the end times a whole lot better. Did last week trip you up a little bit when we talked about the tribulation? Because this week is going to build right on what we talked about last week. But before we even get into it, maybe you've just stumbled across this broadcast. Maybe you don't know the first thing about our church. If you will check out the notes to this episode, there's a link to a YouTube video. When we're done, why don't you watch that YouTube video? Because it will tell you about our church, about this broadcast, about why we try to deliver theology directly to your hotel room or to your home so that we can help you grow in the faith. And maybe as a small group or as a family, you'll do this episode with some friends or family around you. Today, we're going to start a new and another topic while we discuss the end times. The doctrine of the last days is technically called eschatology. And over the past several months, we've talked about the kingdom of God and what that's going to be like. We've talked about life and death and what happens at the end of human history. We've been talking about Jesus' second coming for quite some time now. And starting tonight, we're going to talk about the final judgment. And we'll spend a few weeks on this topic. Now, this is basically what happens after human history ends. And I guess I should just say that before we even get into the Bible, before we even get into some theology today, I want to caution you, we have very little information from the Bible. And nobody's ever been there. Nobody can ever anticipate what it's going to be like after human history ends as we know it. So no one can paint the picture for us except the Bible. And even the Bible gives us very limited information. It does tell us some things about what happens after human history as we know it ends, but the Bible gives us very limited information. So what we're going to talk about today and for the next couple of weeks is all very fuzzy because the Bible just doesn't give us crystal clear information. It does give us some information, though. It tells us that Jesus is King. It tells us that we are going to worship Jesus as King for the rest of eternity, and that worship will be far beyond anything that you can see or imagine. In fact, that's the very language that the Bible uses, that the human mind has not comprehended. We can't even imagine in our own hearts how awesome it might be after the final judgment, when all of this wicked world that we live in has ended. And because this is what we're going to talk about tonight, I'd like us to prepare our hearts to hear from the Bible and to study some theology. And a good way, not the only way, but a great way of preparing your hearts is to sing. So I have a really short song, just a couple of minutes, and the words are going to be right there on the screens. But why don't you go ahead and sing along as we prepare our hearts to hear from the Bible? Sing with this song, will you?
In the darkness, we were waiting, without hope, without light, till from heaven you came running. There was mercy in your eyes to fulfill the law and prophets. To a virgin came the word, from a throne of endless glory to a cradle in the dirt. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise the King of Kings. To reveal the kingdom coming and to reconcile the lost, to redeem the whole creation. You did not despise the cross, for even in your suffering you saw to the other side, knowing this was our salvation. Jesus, for our sake you died. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one, God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings.
We're discussing the final judgment. And the Bible mentions this kind of language multiple times in Old and New Testament. The Old Testament kind of gives the image of what happens when the king returns. And I've used this language months ago in the past. The Old Testament language is the now and the not yet. The New Testament carries this idea, the now and the not yet. The king has come. Jesus has made it very clear that he is the Son of God and he has ushered in the kingdom of God. But he hasn't ushered it all the way in. So the king has come, the now has started, but there's still a whole lot about the kingdom of God that has yet to take a place, and that's the not yet. We're living in this period of human history in the now, but the not yet. And maybe one of the biggest elements of the now and the not yet is the judgment of God, especially the final judgment of God. I've got a verse from the Bible that I want you to hear. Actually, I want you to see it on the screens, hear it with your ears. I want you to say it out loud with your mouth and read along with me as I read this verse out in just a second. But I want you to take it a step further. I'm going to challenge you, everybody who's connected with this broadcast, to memorize 2 Peter chapter 3. Verse 7. Would you memorize it so that it is on your heart and you can think about it and meditate on it all week long this week? Here it is, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are stored up for fire, are being kept for the day of judgment and the destruction of the ungodly. This comes from 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. Now there's some very obvious language in there. There's a coming day. Can't miss that. There is some destruction and fire that's going to happen in that coming day. And apparently that destruction and fire is for both the present heavens and earth that we live in, as well as for the ungodly. The word that this whole verse hangs on is the word judgment. There is a day of judgment coming. And when that day of judgment comes, it's going to be destruction. There will be fire. The heavens and the earth, not just the people that walk on them or those that have lived on earth in the past, but even the heavens and the earth themselves will be judged in this great day of judgment that's coming in the future. This day of judgment happens after human history ends as we know it, which means the rapture has already happened. Go back and watch a couple of weeks ago. The tribulation has already happened. Go back and watch last week. All of those things have already taken place. And then there's this millennium that has happened. And then you have this final judgment. And I want to answer a question that maybe you're asking. If you're not asking, maybe you should be thinking about this question. And the question that I want to answer, and I'll put it right there on the screen for you, is why is there a final judgment in the first place? Why a final judgment? And I got to give credit. This doesn't come just from me. I got to thank Anthony Hoykema for his answers to this question. If you wonder, well, haven't people already died because of the wages of sin? The punishment for sin is death. Hasn't the earth itself already been judged and it's been cursed. This is God's very words in Genesis chapter 3. The ground itself is cursed, Adam, because of what you've just done. Why do we have this final judgment in the first place? And according to Hoykema, there's at least three very big reasons for this final judgment. Don't discount any one of these three reasons. The first is to display God's sovereignty. And what that means is to remind all of those stubborn, rebellious people. And now I'm just not referring to people alone, but the stubborn, rebellious angels that were cast out of God's presence in heaven, that God is still in charge. When I say God's sovereignty, it means that God is the sovereign. This universe is his kingdom. He is still in charge of this kingdom. And even though Satan and his demons, even though wicked people have been able to live their lives in open rebellion against God, the good king and the great judge, this is the moment that every created thing will have no choice but to recognize, you know what, God, you really are the creator. Problem is, for all of those rebellious people, rebellious angels, it's too late. When they recognize God's authority and God's sovereignty at this point, there's no way that they can go back and change what's going to happen next. So point number one is to recognize God's sovereignty or display God's sovereignty. I use D words at the start of each sentence just to help you remember it. Number two is because this is the point where God dispenses rewards and punishment. And this isn't my language. This just doesn't come from the brilliant theologian Hoykema. This is Jesus' language when he says, it would be better for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah than for those towns in Jesus' day that saw Jesus, had a chance to respond to Jesus, and they chose not to respond to Jesus. It's going to be better for the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, who God wiped off of the face of the earth with fire and brimstone. It's going to be better for them than for those cities who saw Jesus in their midst, had the chance to worship him as their king, and they stubbornly refused to. And when he uses better than language, obviously, Jesus is talking about punishment and degrees of punishment. When Jesus says, and by the way, the scriptures make this very clear, that even God's people will one day sit in judgment over the angels in heaven. He's using rewards language here. And the Bible uses rewards and punishment language, but we don't know the full extent of those rewards. We have no idea the full extent of those punishments. All we do know is that the moment where God dispenses that punishment or that reward, it happens at the final judgment. And the word final means there is nothing else after this that can possibly change what's going to happen next for Lucifer and all of his demons, for good people who have bowed their knees and surrendered their soul to Jesus Christ while they were on this earth. Nothing can change what happens next after the final judgment, because the final judgment is absolutely final. Which brings up point number three. This is when the destination, the final destination of all creation, the angels, people, and if you remember from 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, even the heavens and the earth are absolutely judged, and their final destination, their final punishment or reward is dispensed at this point. And nothing and no one can change it. What the Bible describes in the end of the book, the end of the Bible, Revelation chapter 20, is God dispensing judgment on people, on angels, even on the earth itself. And then the Bible uses this language, even death and hell itself are cast into the lake of fire. Even death itself is done away with. Hell itself is done away with. At the final judgment, they're cast into the lake of fire. And then the next words the Bible uses are unmistakable. This is the final judgment, when they're cast into the lake of fire, meaning there is nothing else that can change for all of eternity what happened in the lake of fire, as well as this new heaven and the new earth that God creates. because of the final judgment. So let me wrap this whole discussion up today with a question. And like always, I'm going to ask you to just chop this up. If you're in a group of friends, I'm going to ask you, if you've got your family with you watching this episode, why don't you just get real with each other and discuss this question? But the question is, what do you want the judge to hear while you're on the witness stand? Imagine that there's really a courtroom, that God is really the judge. Imagine that there's really attorneys and there are people in the jury. None of that's going to be the case, but just use human courtroom language to think about the final judgment. Notice I didn't ask the question, what do you want people to not say about you? I asked the question, what do you want people to say about you? What do you want that defense attorney to say when you're on the witness stand and you are being examined before the judge of the universe? And whatever you want that language to be said about you at the final judgment, you live those words out today. And what you live out today, here's what I wanted to end with, will echo into eternity, because the way that you live today will be said about you at the final judgment, which ought to just cause all of us to not just avoid the things that we don't want said about us, but to actually passionately, regularly pursue the things that we do want said about us at the final judgment. So would you just think about it? Talk about it and discuss it as we wrap up this episode. Thanks for joining me. See you back here next time. God bless.